Good morning. Good morning. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Steve Hansen, who will be speaking on the urgent matter of climate change and health. Dr. Steve Hansen has practiced internal medicine in San Luis Obispo since arriving there in the 1970s from the Mayo Clinic. He was president of San Luis Obispo County's largest medical group and directed the cardiopulmonary department at the largest hospital for 25 years. He represented the Tri-Counties physicians as their delegate to the American Medical Association and the California Medical Association for 20 years. He was a surveyor for the Institute for Medical Quality, Workers' Compensation Board, Medicare Case Review, Social Security, Disability, and Hospital Quality Control. He was president and a 25-year board member of the Tri-Counties Blood Bank during the challenging times of HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C pandemic evolution. And he served 3 terms on the University of California's Tobacco Research Advisory Committee. Dr. Hansen is best known for his work in tobacco control policy and other public health disease control and prevention. The San Luis Obispo law, the world's first to ban indoor workplace smoking, including in bars, was proposed by Steve in 1989. He also did the Medical Coalition, yay! He also did the Medical Coalition building and testimony for 6 other bills statewide, including the tobacco ban in all 35 state prisons in 2005. He coordinated the AMA's National Tobacco Control Coalition for 17 years, and he has received many awards. This week, he is featured on the cover of the Medical Association Bulletin for the Central Coast. As a former First 5 Children and Families Commissioner, he has recently convinced the Commission to adopt a resolution of support for climate change action to prevent harm to that young vulnerable population. Dr. Hansen's first presentation on climate change was in 2009 in Mumbai at the World Conference on Tobacco or Health, where he pointed out the fact that climate change will disable or kill more worldwide than the tobacco pandemic will this century. And also that the fossil fuel companies, including Exxon, had been using the same criminal, RICO-like denial, disinformation, deceit, and deception cover-ups as did Big Tobacco. They used several of the same paid think tanks and held pseudoscience symposia, often using re-emergent, recycled pro-tobacco apologists. Schools of public health now teach that climate change is the preeminent peril to a habitable world for all living things, except, he says, perhaps not some beetles. So please welcome Dr. Steve Hansen.
Thanks, Karen, for that too long introduction. You're very kind. My wife's a former English and speech teacher that says you mustn't depress your audience too badly. And so I'd like to recommend this book. It's just out from Steven Pinker, the famous Harvard professor. It's called Enlightenment Now. It's a compilation in 400 or 500 pages about all the good stuff. So take a day like Nicholas Kristof says to read that if you get too depressed, and it will restore your faith. All right, so who knows who started the U.S. National Academy of Sciences? Somebody in here knows that. Abraham Lincoln's right. And he said, you cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. That's what we got to do. We have to make people understand that it's today that their health is being harmed. It's today that action is required. It's today that education is required to really emphasize what's happening. So, if I can make these slides work. Oh dear. For some reason the slides aren't working, I'm sorry. I've got to get that little thing off there. So. Yeah. We good? These were some details of that presentation in Mumbai that, as she noted, I'll skip by those and talk about what happened last year. We started our first Medical Society Consortium on climate and health, and this followed the cancellation of a climate and health meeting that was to be held in Washington, D.C. By the CDC. A 3-day meeting was canceled in fear of Mr. T. Mr. T. The one that was just elected at that time. And the American Medical Association, that was part of this coalition, also, in great cowardice, dropped out of this coalition. Nevertheless, we still have all of these societies: pediatrics, family practice, OBGYN, infectious disease, on and on and on. The latest, as of 2 days ago by a phone call, we're up to 19 societies. Over half of all physicians represented in organized specialty associations are members here. And it's to inform the public and to make sure we have some changes. There are some of the membership right there. And these, I brought some of these extra magazines that Karen held up here. Take one and show it to your doctor. Try to get him involved in the climate change activism. They're a credible source of information, and we need to get more doctors involved. So Americans understand about climate change. The majority of them do, but most of them don't think that it's happening to them. They don't think it's happening now. They don't think it's that serious in their current circumstance. From the perspective of docs, it's quite the opposite. It's at least twice as important to doctors that people know that things are happening now that's imperiling their health. And this report is supposed to help us understand that. We're going to have our first national meeting in mid-April back in Arlington, the DC area. Al Gore, Jimmy Carter, Harvard, University of Washington, and the American Public Health Association jumped in after the CDC canceled their meeting last year and held a one-day meeting at the Carter Center in Atlanta. Some of the publications call it the Atlanta Miracle. They pulled together in short time. There were about 400 of us there. There were only about 12 docs. Most of them were sustainability specialists from state and local and county organizations, various politicians, other international experts, all focusing on the needs of climate and health education and policy. So none of us in this room doubt that there's a consensus about it. You hear the word 97%. A man who was appointed to the Academy of Sciences by Ronald Reagan and reappointed by George Bush surveyed 24,000 recent publications and found that the correlation is about 99% now in terms of assigning, anthropogenic causes to climate change. And there aren't any countervening theories that make any sense at all. So climate change is harming our health all across the nation. We know that this is happening because we've surveyed doctors. We get reports from public health officials who track various infectious diseases, for example, and other kinds of medical problems, worsening chronic disease, things like, oops, oh dear, going backwards. Things like mosquitoes and ticks and waterborne disease and foodborne disease. All those things are increasing or more at risk at times of national or natural disaster events. Some people are at greater risk, and you'll hear this list often, but children can't defend their little bodies from heat risk as well. Student athletes are oftentimes out on a football field in August in heavy gear, and they suffer greatly. Pregnant women, I did a little part of my training down in Arizona when my wife was pregnant. She spent the entire time in the swimming pool. Elderly people, they're the ones who die in the central cities all across America and Europe. You know, they don't have adequate cooling measures. They don't have the wherewithal to go to a cool place necessarily. And studies show that even though elderly people understand about warnings that are broadcast about coming heat emergencies, only half of them take it seriously enough to do anything about it. So we need concerted action. These things are going to get much worse. Governor Brown, in his report, you know, when he went to Europe and talked about it, said the Imperial Valley is going to get up to 120, 130 and stay there for days and become uninhabitable, maybe by mid-century or earlier. Mr. Trump's trying to help. He wants to do away with the Energy Star appliances. He just put a tax on incoming solar panels, and he loves coal. Yeah. I expect we'll see him driving around in a coal-powered car sometime. So, here's some anecdotes about how things are happening now. Boy, do we know about this first one. Biggest fire ever in California was down our way. And the one up north killed more people because it was so fast and intense. Microparticulates. Need to know about microparticulates. There's 3 categories of them. Ultrafine, there's the PM 2.5, which we're most concerned about with health, and then there's larger ones. You can wear a mask, and a mask, an N95 or even an N100 will filter out some of these, and these fire-afflicted areas gave away lots of masks during this time. But it doesn't protect you from the gases, doesn't protect you from the carbon monoxide and the benzopyrene and the benzene that are off-gassed when wood burns. The soot, such a big problem from fires. California now is in a negative tree situation. We're burning more trees than we're growing. And the Paris Accords counted on trees and land use change to account for a 30% increase in carbon capture. We're nowhere near that. You know, soot gets up in the atmosphere, it comes down on polar regions, it discolors the ice and the snow, and then you lose the albedo, and that reflectance lets the polar areas warm, twice as fast as all the rest of us. And that's why we're seeing these remarkable changes in the polar areas, and water without ice on it, the heat just goes directly in and stays there. It's not reflected back. And there's exact percentages for snow, ice, water, and it's pretty grim, pretty grim when it gets to be water. So you can see this picture of, I think it's LA here in the smog. The Central Valley is the nation's worst bad air place. And Trump gets confused when he talks about clean air and clean water. He thinks we're talking about this. No, we're talking about the CO2 that's trapped in the troposphere. I don't think he's ever said the word troposphere, but that's where the stuff is that's going to stay there for hundreds of years, and because of the inertia in the system, it's going to lead to long-term warming, and the effects on health are really incalculable at this point. Ragweed loves heat and CO2 and seems to grow more, and we're certainly seeing more allergies and asthma in that regard. So I'm not going to read these verbatim. That's a bad thing to do, but you can see what it does. It changes all these things we've been talking about, and that increases the amount of health care that's needed, and even deaths and progressive disabilities are worsened. Anybody can be harmed by this. I got my flu shot this year, but got some flu like most of the rest of people did, and started to wheeze for the first time in my life. You know, driving on the 10 to the desert one day, had an episode of laryngospasm. This shouldn't happen. Here's an anecdote about an ER doc in Carolina. They had their worst wildfire back in '08 after a huge drought, and you can see how big it was and how expensive it was. Burned for 3 months, and the researchers thought that that would be a good chance to study the areas affected by the plume of the fire and the others. So you can see what they looked at there: asthma, pneumonia, infections, heart attacks, other cardiac conditions like arrhythmias. And here's the plume. It starts at A on your upper left and drifts inland. And the cartoon at the bottom shows that the brown areas were the most affected, so they compared those counties with the others. And they found that a 50% increase in trips to the ER for COPD, and it's always in the top 5 of killer diseases in the country, you know, emphysema and chronic obstructive lung disease, pneumonia, bronchitis, all those were increased 50%, as was heart disease, a little less dramatic. But they concluded that forests are just as harmful to people as they are to homes and neighborhoods. So the fire season, we used to talk about a fire season in California. No, it's all the time. One of my patients was the local Cal fire chief. He says it's every month now. And the head of the U.S. Forest Service says almost all our budget goes to fighting fires. He said we ought to be called the U.S. Fire Service. It's you know, the chance of repopulating or thinning the forests like ought to happen isn't going to happen. So extreme weather, I think the Defense Department people say it best when they say it's a force multiplier. Heat is a force multiplier for natural disasters. It's just simple common sense that the hotter things are, the more energy is stored in the systems you're talking about, usually the seas. And it accentuates both ends of the hydrological cycle. The droughts and the downpours are worse. more flooding, more debris flows, as we saw in Montecito. All that's part of our future. Injury, death, displacement knocks out power, phone lines. You know, the 101 highway was, what, 3 weeks or something, knocked out down in Santa Barbara area. It's hard for people to get to their medical care, to their hospital, to refill their medicines, and just to get around. So, again, we've got the children, older people, and people with disabilities most affected. Here's a picture from the Northern California fire, the one that burned in Napa and Sonoma, Santa Rosa. And you can see in 1 day's time what the smoke developed into. That's covering the Bay Area, where they recorded the highest particulate counts that had ever been seen in that area. Remarkable fast fire. The brush, the chaparral in some of the areas in Santa Rosa was 10, 15 feet deep. And it just went up like tinder. People couldn't get away, they burned. The trend in heavy precipitation, you see on the left the Depression times, the terrible droughts at that time. That's when a huge proportion of Oklahoma moved to California and lowered the collective IQ in both places. I'm from Nebraska originally. We hate those Okies in football. At any rate, you can see it's certainly going up now. Baton Rouge, Red Stick, was hit with a 1,000-year flood in 2016. This is a city that's built up on a big plateau to protect it from flooding. Worst national disaster since Sandy. I've got the same thing that Mark does. You know, I got no. It's just it's a brain damage thing. It has to do with being emotional, and John Boehner had it. You know that's. At any rate, this was a big deal for Baton Rouge. 30,000 people had to be rescued by the Coast Guard. 13 died. 10,000 people were in shelters. And it was a state of emergency. 180,000 homes and buildings were damaged in a city of less than 250,000. Months later, all this trash was sitting out. The government is responsible for that trash. Homeowners aren't. It was a healthcare crisis for many, and all the problems that we talked about before in terms of continuity of care and so forth were exacerbated. Stress and depression, inability to function, all worse, especially for kids. So, we're looking at longer heat waves, more intense heat waves, more humidity, a higher heat index, and all these stresses the systems of people and animals. Our extinction rate is going up, and we're not exempt. Who can be harmed? Outdoor workers, pregnant women, student athletes, city dwellers. Does this sound familiar? People who lack air conditioning. Think about the places in the developing world that are going to want air conditioning. The world's biggest city is going to be Mumbai. The biggest country is going to be India. Paul Hawkins' book says the number one thing he's worried about is refrigerants, as far as you've seen his book Drawdown. Refrigerants getting up into the troposphere as well. So kids, older adults, and people taking certain medications. Our California men's colony is a big prison. It's was once the second largest prison in the northern hemisphere, and lawsuits came along and reduced the size of the place, but it's still a big prison. And when it gets to be 90 degrees, at least a fourth of those prisoners are on medications that demand that they be inside and get refuge from the heat. So that's a reflection of how many psychiatric people are in prison, because most of these are antipsychotic drugs, but there are other anticholinergic drugs and so forth that impair your sweating ability and your ability to respond to heat. So there's a lot of medications that people are taking that don't do well with heat as well. This is a little anecdote about a pediatrician whose son collapsed when the heat index reached 120. And you can see there that he had his long sleeve shirt on. Kids don't necessarily dress for the weather, they dress for what they think looks cool. So do the mentally ill. You see those people wandering around in coats in terrible weather. We got to look out for these people. We don't have the video here, so I'm skipping over this. This is another thing to emphasize that whatever you think about football and those 5,000 NFL players that have sued for brain damage, it is also a heat-related risk. And so this young man ended up with heat stroke, kidney failure, and pulmonary edema, which means water on the lungs, and he had to be on a breathing machine and dialysis, but he got over it. So we've said before, kids don't regulate their body temperatures like adults do, but that quits being the case when adults get to be seniors. Kids spend more time outdoors, and they need to be reminded to take refuge from the heat as well. ER visits increased quite a bit, and half those ER visits were kids or adolescents. So leading cause of death and disability in young athletes, 9,000 school athletes treated for heat illnesses. Young men make up a third of all heat-related ER visits, and football players, 11 times more likely to get exertional heat illnesses than all the other high school sports combined. So here is the sesame seed-sized tick that causes Lyme disease, and the Aedes aegypti mosquito. You can see the little white bands on his legs there. Climate change is causing increasing temperatures, too much or too little rain, severe weather events. As heat extends further north and it extends higher up mountain ranges, the range of these critters is expanded. And the longer it stays warmer, they're more active, they eat more, and sometimes what they eat is us. Tick carries Lyme disease it's in more than half of the U.S. counties now. It's up 30% from 20 years ago. And West Nile virus, dengue fever are thriving. Zika virus is a game changer, you know, such a different thing. It's been around for years. It's such a mild virus that people don't know they have it. It's the first mosquito-borne virus to be able to be transmitted sexually, both men to women and women to men, for months after. A woman can be carrying this virus. It's been measured up to 3 months. Even a pregnant woman can carry it even longer, because pregnancy is a condition of immune impairment. You know, in order to tolerate the baby, the immune system quiets down a little bit. And so we get these terrible brain-damaged microcephalic children. Their whole neural axis is affected. They're blind. They're in diapers for life. The CDC estimates that one Zika case costs about $10 million, probably in medical and socioeconomic and welfare costs long term. Yellow fever, they're short of yellow fever vaccine right now, using so much of it. Please keep in mind that malaria used to be a great pestilence in the country. The Public Health Service is headquartered still in Atlanta because that used to be a hotbed of malaria down there. So most mosquitoes we think of as being active in the evening and so on, but the Aedes aegypti mosquito is a little more social. It likes to be indoors, and it's there all day long. Here's now the past president of the American College of Physicians, my organization, and he in Rhode Island and his partners saw an alarming increase in Lyme disease. That's right next door to Connecticut, where Lyme disease was named from and originally identified. And they're seeing, because of change in the climate and more activity of the insects, that they have more time to bite humans. And it's all over the country now. Contaminated food, when refrigeration is impaired, or when we leave food out and it's really hot, there's increased risk for foodborne disease. Contaminated water happens when there's floods and streams overflow or sewer systems are compromised. There's still areas in Santa Rosa where they can't use public water because of contaminants still in the water system there, things like benzene and so forth. They're trying to get rid of. The fire burned so deeply it harmed some of the pipes. Threats to nutrition. Doesn't take too many terribly hot days to ruin a crop. The Midwest a few years back had great crop failures. Threats to nutrition of all sorts are worse when the temperature of the water is changed, when water supplies for irrigation is compromised, and so forth. And this thing about mental well-being and mental health is certainly active. 26 million refugees. What's a refugee? Well, the UN defines it as a person fleeing socio-political danger, not a climate refugee. So people displaced by climate things aren't covered and aren't given the protection and don't have access to immigration to other places that folks covered under the old political notions of what's a refugee. That has to change. So much of what I was just saying here, but think Syria. 1 million Syrian farmers, through the drought and the heat, lost their ability. I'm sorry, folks. This is a bad disease, I tell you. Sympathize with Mark Russell. He did better than I. So 3 million people then were displaced, homeless, went to the cities, got involved in the war, got involved in militant activities, got depressed, got suicidal, those kind of things. And it's happening other places too, of course. Think about the Rohingya. Think about other displaced people. Drug and alcohol abuse, oh, thank you, comes along with any kinds of stress and tension. And the problems with children, we're probably just seeing the early phases of some of those. So 1 in 3 people recognize the urgency right now. Doctors in interviews are about twice that. And we've already enumerated those things which are top of the list as far as what we're seeing. Allergies, asthma, heat-related illness, infections. Here's a map of, it's probably a little outdated now, it's a couple years old, where we look at those things that are most active in any part of the country. And it's kind of hard to read, but I'll promise you that there'll be more things moving north, and we'll have similar kinds of crises all throughout the country. So what can we do? Well, we can keep it at the top of our agenda. We can make sure that doctors pay attention to it and talk to decision makers about it. Buy efficient appliances. You know, if you go to Japan or Europe, you're going to see very much smaller and more efficient appliances. We should do that. There are anti-competitive laws on clean energy. That has to stop. Plant-based food choices, you know that to produce a pound of meat, you use 16 times more water than an equivalent amount of vegetable protein. Public transportation, and keeping on top of your legislators. Legislators spelled with dollar signs because that's all they understand for the most part. The Koch brothers and others are putting huge amounts of money into the 2018 elections, and it'll be an uphill fight. And affiliate with a local group like you already have. So the tax on the solar panels, keep in mind that it's only the solar panels that's a problem. So it's the labor and the other materials aren't being subject to that tax. So that shouldn't really inhibit solar panel use. The drawdown book emphasizes the importance of wind energy, both on and offshore. Impediments to the building of those things need to be minimized. Here's the famous Mediterranean diet. Well-proven health benefits to the Mediterranean diet, but every one of the things on that slide is going to be a little harder to grow in a heat-intolerant world. We're already overfishing greatly, and the United States is low in its use of electric buses. On a list of countries that use electric buses, we're pretty low, and that can change. We all can try to get more personal exercise and benefit our health. You know, it doesn't take a lot of exercise to get a health benefit, and we all should probably work on that and use less fossil fuel in the meantime. So, health benefits from these solutions. My time up? No. So here's the usual list. It really is important to have city policies that encourage trees to stay away from heat island effects. There's a thing called LIDAR, which is has been improved about 7-fold and can detect areas in the city that are heavy with particulates. And cities then can look to see if there's a particular enterprise or business or place where buses idle or something that is contributing to that. There's some technological things that can be done here. But trees and cooling is so important. Thank you. I don't know if I have There may be time for a question or two. 5 minutes. So take one of these books and give it to your doctor and sign him up, sign her up. Sir?
What is the hope for the Zika vaccine?
Oh, that's a good question. The Zika vaccine was one of the things that looks good now. It works in animal trials. It was rushed through with the Army in charge, thinking of it as a national threat, and they put aside the usual restrictions and mandating that everybody get to do it. No, they rushed it through. And they spent millions on it, and it's in FDA trials now, and it will come along, and it looks good so far in animal trials, because we don't have any treatment for it now. Madam.
Hi, my name is Pam Saunders, and I just want to say that I have asthma, and it's called adult onset asthma.
Can happen any age.
Yeah, and well, I lost 2 brothers to asthma. I take about 4, I use 2 inhalers a day, and I take 2 pills, and they're looking at giving me a shot that's going to supposedly help. It's so depressing to have to live indoors, stay away from things that are blooming and the air that is dirty, and I just don't know what to do about it anymore.
I don't either. One can't Netflix and chill forever, and just, I guess that's what these old malls are for. We just have to demand that people listen to CCL. We have to emphasize that coal makes no sense in the modern world, things like that.
I can see that it's getting worse.
Yeah.
The air is getting worse, and we really need to do something about getting our air cleaner and whatever little things we can do to do that.
Thank you. I think that if we keep emphasizing the CO2 in the troposphere, there'll be a trickle-down effect to pollution at sea level. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, a couple of things, Doctor. Is there any one publication? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm George Shea, Studio City, the San Fernando Valley chapter. Really? A little closer. That's better. Yeah. Anyway, I'm George Shea, Studio City, the San Fernando Valley chapter. Is there a publication that would be worth spending some time on, like a book or whatever? Is that? I just thinking about the report that you were quoting from in your.
This is evolving rapidly. If you go to the website for the Medical Society Consortium, like is on the screen here, you can find references to other publications. And I did want to mention one of the latest things was what came out of the World Economic Forum in Davos just a week or 2 ago, where they listed the top 10 risks in terms of impact and the top 10 risks in terms of likelihood. And the top 10 risks in terms of impact, 8 out of 10 of them were related to climate change. They put weapons of mass destruction at the top, but it didn't appear in the second list in terms of likelihood. Nobody really believes there's going to be a nuclear conflagration when you get right down to it. Extreme weather events, national disasters, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, water crises, food crises, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, large-scale involuntary migration, and spread of infectious diseases were the rest of that top 10. Top 10 risks in terms of likelihood: extreme weather events, national disasters, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, large-scale involuntary migration, and man-made environmental disasters. Now, these are ahead of terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, illicit trade, asset bubbles, data fraud.
Thank you.
You're in the right place.
I have something embarrassing to admit.
Uh-oh.
Steve and Ann stayed at my house. I'm so excited, and I didn't connect the two. So when I saw Dr. Hansen come up on the stage, oh, that's Dr. Hansen. And I'm glad I didn't, because I would have been intimidated.
Oh, dear.
But let me say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. It combined such good information with the stories, the anecdotes, which really brings things home to me. And I have been intimidated to make any presentations to community groups or churches in my area because I don't feel like I'm a good speaker. But when I'm listening to your talk, I'm thinking, I could do this.
Yeah.
My community, which is Mid-City, would respond to this.
Sure.
So my question is it possible for
You can
this-
have all the slides.
Could I have all the slides?
Yeah, sure.
And some practice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other thing that should be mentioned when it comes to education was the fact that the Heartland Institute and the Koch brothers mailed bogus nonsense to all the science teachers in the country, 200,000 of them. You've probably heard about this. Yeah. It was reported in the journal Science, and it's been documented since. There's a number of people working on this, and you each should. I talked with our superintendent of schools. He said he didn't think that the local people would buy it. You know, it was doubt and denial and disinformation and pleas for inaction until we're certain, and that sort of nonsense. So this happened just last year, March 28th, 2017, and it's still going on. There's a number of countervailing books that can be purchased inexpensively. I'm going to buy $500 worth for our local county to make sure that they get into all the schools, but and I can give you that information if you'd like. Madam, oh, am I done? Okay.
Doctor, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Vicky Cha. I am in the Riverside chapter, new to CCL and actually new to California. Doctor, I wanted to thank you also for raising the issue of developing countries. I've spent most of the past 15 years working in the developing world. I worked in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, which get to 130 degrees in the summertime, with the vast majority of the population not having air conditioning, as you said.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you know if any more serious steps are being taken on the issue of recognizing climate change refugees, because I think it's a huge destabilizer in the world.
I don't think I don't think it's an issue that's really had a voice. I think it's important for you to start bringing that more. I certainly will. But yeah, as there will be more refugees from climate-based displacement, and they're like Pakistan sent back the Rohingya, didn't they? And there's a 1955 law that is the United States is signatory to, that says you have to take a certain amount of refugees, and there needs to be expansion of that for climate refugees.